Ladies and gentlemen, for the benefit of those who will be watching this presentation on film, allow me to repeat for everyone a most sincere welcome into our home. Your interest in the John Birch Society, as evidenced by your presence here, is deeply appreciated. And because of this presumption of interest on your part, I've put together an in-depth presentation, which I suppose is merely a subtle way of preparing you for the fact that I'm going to be talking for quite a while. But the subject matter is large, and assuming you didn't come here merely to be entertained, there's no other way to provide the information you want. To narrow the field as much as possible, let me begin by explaining what ground I do not intend to cover. First of all, I will not talk about the spread of communism, foreign policy, riots, campus disorders, assaults against police, drug abuse, pornography, crime, or taxes. My topic is not the many problems that confront this nation. It is, hopefully, the solution to those problems. Secondly, it's not my goal to make conservatives, anti-communists, or activists out of anyone who doesn't already consider himself to be such. I have no illusions about my ability to deliver a single lecture which can reverse the attitudes of a lifetime. My realistic goal is not to sell the principles and program of the society, but merely to identify them and to expound them. Next, it's not my purpose to pressure or embarrass anyone into joining the John Birch Society. That's not how it's done. Most of us became members only after considerable thought and study, and we expect that others will follow that same pattern. Now, naturally, we would be more than delighted if the non-members present did decide to join with us. That almost goes without saying. As a matter of fact, I would like all of you to consider this presentation as an open invitation to the John Birch Society. But your private response to that invitation must be entirely voluntary, and there will be no embarrassing pressure of any kind. And finally, I'm not going to try to answer the many charges that have been leveled against the John Birch Society. I realize that at one time or another, you've all heard that the society is fascist, secret, un-American, extremist, anti-Semitic, racist, even communist. But I learned a long time ago that it's a useless waste of time trying to answer these charges. First of all, the list is endless. They make up new ones faster than you can answer the old ones. And secondly, if I were to take that approach, you might learn a few of the things the John Birch Society is not, but you still wouldn't know what it is. So instead of approaching this subject from the negative point of view, I prefer the positive. If I can succeed in explaining what the John Birch Society is, then you'll understand quite well indeed what it is not. So let's turn now to the basic question. What is the John Birch Society? To answer that question, I've devised a definition which, although entirely accurate, will hardly satisfy you when you hear it. Nevertheless, here it is. The John Birch Society is a voluntary group of men and women who have joined together to promote more effectively the principles in which they believe in accordance with a plan of action designed to overcome the opposition against them. Now, what's that all about? It doesn't tell us very much because there are three questions yet to be answered. What are the principles in which they believe? What is the plan of action? And what is the opposition brought to bear against them? The answers to these three questions will tell us almost all there is to know about the John Birch Society. So let's take them in turn now, one by one. To explain the principles in which we believe, it'll be necessary to divide them into four categories: political, economic, social, and religious. Now, as far as our political principles are concerned, usually we're described as conservatives. But the debate, or the dialogue as it's now called, is not between conservatives and liberals. It goes back in history long before those words were ever invented. The opposing points of view properly are identified as individualism versus collectivism, and their champions are called individualists and collectivists. Now, the members of the John Birch Society consider themselves to be individualists, and here are the differences between the two as we see them. First of all, the individualist believes that the rights of the individual must not be obliterated by the desires of the collective or the group. The collectivist, on the other hand, believes that the group is more important than the single person within it, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. The individualist believes that with rights come responsibilities. And since we insist on individual rights, therefore we accept the principle of individual responsibility rather than group responsibility. We believe that every man has a personal and direct responsibility to provide first for himself, next for his family, and then for those outside his family who may be in need. The collectivist, on the other hand, declares that the individual is not personally responsible for charity, for raising his own children, providing for his aging parents, or even providing for himself, for that matter. This is a group function of the state, of government itself. As a matter of fact, this is always one sure way to spot who is an individualist and who is a collectivist. The individualist wants to be free to do it himself. The collectivist wants the government to do it for him. He's enamored by government. He idolizes government. He has a fixation on government as the ultimate group mechanism to solve all problems. Now, the reason is because government is the one group that can legally force everyone to participate. It has the power of taxation, backed by jails and force of arms, if necessary, to compel everyone to fall in line. And this leads to the third difference between the two groups. Simply stated, the individualist believes in freedom. The collectivist believes in compulsion. Now, let me give a few illustrations. As stated a moment ago, we believe that every man has a personal responsibility to provide for himself, if he can, and for his dependents. This means that routinely, we should all set aside a portion of our current earnings for the inevitability of unemployment through sickness, accident, or retirement. But as individualists, we also believe that we should be free not to do this if for whatever reason we prefer to act in some other manner. If we wish to live to the full extent of our income and plan to depend on our children or other relatives in our old age, or if we choose to take our chances on a greater income in later years, or even if we choose consciously to fall back on charity as a way of life, for whatever reason, we believe that a person should be free to choose his own course. We have no right to force him to comply with our ideas of what he should do. Now, by contrast, the collectivist says that since some people don't have the brains or the willpower or the desire to save on their own, let us pass a law and use the power of government to force them. There must not be freedom of choice in this matter, otherwise there will be many who do not do what we know they should do. This same contrast can be seen in the area of charity. We believe that every man has a personal responsibility to be generous to those in need. But as individualists, we also believe that a man should be free not to be charitable if he doesn't want to. If he prefers to give to a different charity than the one we urge on him, if he prefers to give a smaller amount than what we think he should give, or if he prefers not to give at all, we don't believe we have any right to gang up on him and force him either directly by mob violence or indirectly by the ballot box. In either case, the principle is the same. It's called stealing. True charity is the voluntary giving of your own money. Government charity is the giving of someone else's money, which of course is why it's so popular. And so the individualist believes that every man must be free in this matter to act or not to act as he sees fit. The collectivist believes just the reverse. Because there are some who will not be charitable as we think they should be, let us pass a law and use government to force them. Let's not call it stealing, though. Let's call it welfare. And so it goes on almost every conceivable issue in which the end result generally is conceded to be desirable. As individualists, we believe in freedom of choice. The collectivist inevitably turns to the coercion of government force. Now, we hear a lot of talk today about right-wingers, left-wingers, extremists, and moderates. So let's turn now to the question of where the John Birch Society stands in the political spectrum. The political spectrum concept, if it has any meaning at all, is a measurement scale showing all the variations in government, ranging from 0 at one end to 100% at the other. Now, the extremists at the 0 end would be those who advocate no government at all, the anarchists. The extremists at the other end would be those who advocate total government. And who are they? Well, the communists, of course, but also the Nazis, the fascists, and any others, no matter what they may call themselves. If they advocate total government control over the people, they are all, by definition, totalitarians. Communism and Nazism are not opposites. Call it right or left, it makes no difference. They're both at the same totalitarian end of the political spectrum. But where does the John Birch Society fit into this picture? Aren't we supposed to be the extremists? That's what we hear constantly. Well, the truth of the matter is, we turn out to be the real middle of the roaders. Not that we think that's any particular virtue in itself, but we are just as opposed to the extreme of anarchy as we are to the extreme of totalitarianism. As members of the John Birch Society, we recognize that government is absolutely necessary for an orderly society. But following the dictum that government, like fire, is both beneficial and dangerous, we believe in the concept of limited government. And we believe that the constitutional republic created by our founding fathers is the best form of limited government that has yet been devised by man. Now, to understand why we feel this way, it'll be necessary to define the word republic and to point out the differences between a republic and a democracy. Now, democracy is a form of government based upon the principle of majority rule, period, end of discussion. Now, that's not very complicated. Majority rule. It's easy to understand, easy to sell to the masses, and I might add, deadly. For example, what would you call a lynch mob? That's majority rule. There's only one dissenting vote, and he's at the end of the rope. Now, that's pure democracy in action. But wait a minute, you say. The majority should rule, yes, but not to the extent of destroying the rights of the minority. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are no longer describing a democracy. We are speaking of a republic. A republic is a limited democracy. It's a form of government based upon the principle of limited majority rule. Limited so that the minority, even a minority of one, can be protected against the whims and passions of the majority. And how do you protect the minority from the majority? You write down a set of rules on a piece of paper. You say, this we can do, that we cannot. At the top of the paper, you write the word Constitution. And then everyone agrees to follow the rules no matter what the temptation. And when you're finished, you've created a constitutional republic. Notice that the entire function of our Bill of Rights is to spell out in detail the many ways in which the majority, acting through government, must not be allowed to infringe on the rights of the minority. The First Amendment sets the pace with the words, Congress shall pass no law. And then the document proceeds to explain that Congress, even though it expresses the will of the majority, shall not deny the minority the right of free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, the right to bear arms, and others. Congress shall not. The majority shall not. This is the meaning of a republic. And it didn't just happen that way accidentally. Our founding fathers knew exactly what they were doing. Remember that interesting exchange of letters between Thomas Jefferson and a friend who had criticized him for being distrustful of men with political power? Using the same argument we so often hear today, the friend asked, have you no faith in the men we elect? Have you no confidence in our government? And remember that beautiful reply. Jefferson said, confidence is everywhere the parents of despotism. In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. And there, in a single phrase, is the best summary you'll ever find of a republic. Binding men down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. And this is the concept of limited government in which the members of the John Birch Society believe. Well, all right, so much for our political principles. Now let's turn to the economic principles in which we believe. To accurately describe ourselves in this category, it would be proper to say that we are, are you ready? We are laissez-faire capitalists. Now, I never knew what a laissez-faire capitalist was until I went to college. And then I learned that it was a big, fat man with an expensive cigar, a diamond stick pin in his cravat, spats on his shoes, sitting on a huge bag of money, squeezed out of the exploited toil of frail women and starving children. Seriously, if anyone had told me then that he was a capitalist, much less a laissez-faire capitalist, I would have thought that he was the meanest, greediest man in the whole world. It wasn't until many years later that I found out what those words actually meant. And lo and behold, I was shocked to discover that I was a laissez-faire capitalist. Now, laissez-faire capitalism merely means the private ownership of property. In other words, owned by the people instead of the politicians, with a minimum of government interference in the marketplace. Laissez-faire means simply let the people do it. Now let's get one thing straight right here. There are very few rich people in the John Birch Society. I wish we had more, but we don't. Most of us come from the lower and middle economic levels of the nation. In other words, we're part of that broad middle class that still works for a living and pays the taxes. Frankly, we would like to become rich if we could, and I think most of you would too. Even our socialist friends would like to be rich socialists. They don't object to wealth. It's just the other guy's wealth that bothers them. The desire to become rich, of course, is by no means our only motivation for promoting free enterprise, nor even our primary motivation. We're quite aware that in spite of our best efforts, most of us will never accumulate vast wealth. But it's our firm conviction that laissez-faire capitalism not only makes it possible for some to enjoy the true luxury of riches, but more important than that, it enables all the rest of us to raise our standard of living far in excess of what is possible under any other concept. And this is the key. No one wants to see people go hungry or live in poverty. And the one thing that collectivists and individualists hold in common is their desire to produce a system that will raise the level of the poor. Their differences lie, as always, in how to achieve this goal. The collectivist is not very complicated in his approach. He looks around him, sees some very rich people living high on the hog. He sees poor people with barely enough to get by. He remembers his old Robin Hood movies, and eureka, he's got the solution. Take it from the rich and give it to the poor. What could be simpler than that? It's a perfect solution, except for one minor detail. It doesn't work. Now, one reason why it doesn't work, and never has worked, and never can work, is that the rich just don't have enough to go all the way around. Now, for instance, on the international scene, we know that the United States, by comparison to the rest of the world, is a very rich uncle. Yet, if we had some magic device for converting everything of value in this country into cash, and then dividing it equally among all the people of the world, if we could tear down every building, brick by brick, cash them in, including the value of the labor, if we could cash in all the machines, roads, automobiles, TV sets, everything except the clothes on our backs, do you have any idea to what extent we would raise the standard of living of the people of the world? They would be allowed to eat and dress and live like we do in this country for about 1 week. And then it would all be gone. If all the millionaires in America were taxed 100% of their incomes each year, not a single penny left for themselves, it would run the federal government for less than 39 hours. In fact, if all the income were taken from those making only $25,000 a year or more, if they were allowed to keep nothing for themselves, it would still run the government for less than 72 hours. Now, when you consider these facts, several things become rather obvious. First, it's the little guy who's paying most of the taxes. And secondly, it always will be the little guy who pays most of the taxes, because even if we take it all away from the rich man, there just isn't enough to do the job. Now, the point is simply this. You can't help the poor by pulling down the rich. Now, it may make you feel better to do so. You may envy the wealth of others. You may resent the attitude and behavior of those with wealth. You may feel that they don't deserve it. You may be a politician who knows you can always get votes by promising to soak the rich. But if your concern really is only for the poor, then you're wasting your time. You can't help the poor by pulling down the rich. Well, how then do you help the poor? Well, first of all, the individualist recognizes that there is no utopia. There always will be those who, for a variety of reasons, will be unable to produce. Infants, the sick, the lame, the mentally retarded. And we also recognize that the only way for these unproductive individuals to live at all is off the surplus of those who do produce. Now, that's basic. The problem before us, then, is how to expand the surplus. Unless we can do that, the poor shall stay poor, no matter how much we wish to help them. Now, following this in sequence, then, how do we expand the surplus? How do we achieve a situation in which each productive human being becomes increasingly more productive? Now, the answer, of course, is that the productive individual must be given some incentive for making an increased effort, for working harder or longer, or for investing in tools. Few people choose to work unless they're motivated by some incentive outside of the work itself. Now, there are four kinds of human incentive. Fear, the motivation of the slave. Hate, the motivation of the victim. Altruism, the motivation of the philosopher. And fourthly, desire for reward, the motivation of everyone. Now, of the four, the desire for material reward is by far the most powerful and sustaining incentive for most people. It follows, therefore, and please note this carefully, that the degree to which government taxes away the material rewards from those who produce in order to give to those who do not produce, that is the degree to which government destroys the incentive to continue producing, and hence is the degree to which it reduces the surplus and hurts those who must live off that surplus, the very people supposedly it's trying to help. Now, we all know of cases where the progressive income tax, for instance, has discouraged some wealthy businessmen from expanding their businesses. The man says to himself, why should I take on a new business venture? It would only mean more work and more headaches, and why should I risk my capital? I could lose everything. On the other hand, if I did everything right, made no mistakes at all, why, the government would only take most of my profits anyway, so why do it? And he doesn't do it. Which means there's one more business never begun, one more factory never built, thousands of jobs never created, millions of dollars never added to the surplus. And who is hurt by this process? The rich man? Of course not. True, he may not become quite as wealthy as he would otherwise, but he continues to live very well indeed. In the final analysis, government manipulation of the marketplace always hurts the poor far more than the rich. And this is a fact of life the collectivist never seems to understand. The collectivist approach always is to divide up the existing economic pie into equal shares, to make sure that no one gets any larger or smaller piece than anyone else. Of course, you may have noticed that those in charge of dividing up the pie usually wind up with a larger piece for their equal share. This, by the way, is one of the great contradictions between Marxist theory and practice. In theory, communism is a classless society. Everyone supposedly belongs to the same class with no economic differences or privileges. Yet in practice, in every country where communism has come to power, the commissars and cadre of the Communist Party live like kings, while the workers and peasants continue to struggle for the bare necessities of life. Now, the individualist recognizes the fact that under any system, someone is going to have more pie than others. The only question is, who is it going to be? Should it be the politicians and bureaucrats who divide the pie? Or should it be the people who have worked to make the pie? Now, if the dividers of pie get the larger piece, then the producers slow down, and there's less pie for everyone. But if the producers are allowed to keep what they produce and dispense the surplus as they see fit, then they'll work harder and longer, they'll invent, they'll invest, and they'll produce more pie than you've ever dreamed was possible. And there'll be more for everyone. And then those who have even the smallest pieces out of the larger pie will end up with more pie than those who are stuck with equal pieces, so-called, out of the smaller pie. Now, that's a lot of pie for an analogy, but it's an accurate summary of the humanitarian function of the free enterprise system. And the reason why in less than 150 years this nation sprang up from a hostile wilderness and became the envy of the collectivist old world. Over 120 years ago, a French economist by the name of Frederick Bastiat wrote an essay entitled The Law. It contains one of the clearest and most compelling statements of political philosophy that you'll ever find. In straightforward language and logic, Bastiat proves beyond all doubt that the proper function of government is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens, but not to provide for them. To protect and not to provide. For in order to provide for some, first it must take from others. And once it has been granted the power to take from some and give to others, then it becomes the potential mechanism for what Bastiat called legalized plunder. The control of that mechanism becomes a highly coveted tool by individuals and groups who wish to line their own pockets out of the taxes taken from someone else. Everybody wants in on the take. Businessmen clamor for tariffs and price-fixing laws so they can charge higher prices. And when the consumers discover what's going on, instead of calling for the elimination of all such government favoritism, they merely start demanding that they get theirs too. Labor unions clamor for minimum wage laws. Farmers nuzzle up to the trough and demand price supports. The unemployed want benefits. Families want apartments. Students want grants. Colleges want subsidies. The entire process spirals around and around until finally everybody is plundering everybody. And in the end, when taxes skyrocket to the point where there's nothing left to plunder, then the whole system collapses and the game is over. All that's left is the plundering mechanism itself, total government. And freedom is lost. This process, described by Bastiat over 120 years ago, is exactly what's happening in America today. And his warning about the end result of that process constitutes still a third reason why we champion the free enterprise concept. Even if collectivism were not morally wrong, even if it did produce a higher standard of living, we would still oppose it because freedom is more important than prosperity. To resist a tyranny, you must be independent of that tyranny for your subsistence. If the government provides your food, your clothing, your shelter, your education, your job, your medical care, your retirement, then the government controls you most effectively indeed. If that government should ever become tyrannical, and they have a way of doing that in history, then you've had it, my friends. We believe that one of the greatest lessons of history that so desperately needs to be relearned by the American people, our forefathers knew it well, is this. Anytime a government is powerful enough to give the people everything they want, it is also powerful enough to take from the people everything they've got. You cannot have one without the other. Well, let's turn now to the social principles in which we believe. Because we are individualists and accept the concept of personal responsibility for ourselves and our dependents, therefore, we view the family as the basic unit of society, secondary only to the individual himself. All totalitarian regimes, whether of ancient Sparta or modern Peking, all of them strive to destroy the close-knit family in order to remove any loyalties that might be higher than to the state itself. They don't like competition. Totalitarians would prefer no family units at all if they could force that on the people. The communes of Red China or Haight-Ashbury are ideal for their purposes. But almost the same results can be achieved even within the institution of matrimony if only the people involved can be induced to abandon their parental responsibilities, because the real objective is to remove the family as a possible alternate source of guidance and support. And so the John Birch Society is committed to the preservation and strengthening of the family for practical as well as moral reasons. Now, we believe that all men are equal in the eyes of their Creator, and that all men should be treated equally by the law. But we also believe in freedom of association, that man should be free to select those with whom he chooses to work, to play, or to live. We believe that this is essential to any truly free society, and besides, it's entirely natural. In general, people prefer to associate with those who share something in common with them. They prefer to be with those who are approximately the same age, the same educational level, the same interests and hobbies, the same economic strata, the same religion, the same race, the same tastes in entertainment, the same political views. And everyone does this, to one degree or another. You do it. I do it. Now, there's a name for this process. It's called discrimination. In order to select those with whom you wish to associate, you must, by definition, be discriminate. You must be free to reject those with whom you do not wish to associate. Otherwise, you can't choose. Well, now, the problem, of course, arises in the fact that today, because of increasing racial tensions, the word discrimination has become confused with the word hatred. But they're not at all the same. Just because you prefer to be with those of your own age group doesn't mean that you have to hate those who are older or younger than you. And this is equally true in the case of race or religion or any other category. Furthermore, we believe that government has absolutely no business attempting to dictate the social relationships between individuals and groups. We find no constitutional basis for this, no moral basis, and certainly no logical basis. For every time government steps in and uses the force of law to rearrange social relationships in accordance with some omnipotent formula, it always makes matters worse. It's like trying to stop a dog from barking by throwing stones at him. Now, please understand, this means we are just as opposed to a state government forcing segregation as we are opposed to the federal government forcing integration. Both are wrong. Government should stay out of this matter entirely and leave it up to the individuals involved. At any rate, inside the John Birch Society, we practice what we preach. Membership is open to all races, all religions, all classes. They're all there, and they're all welcome. In some places, we have entirely Negro chapters. In others, both Negro and white together. But I can assure you, in every case, the arrangement is because the individuals directly involved want it that way. We make no effort to force a prescribed formula on anyone. And frankly, we think that the world would be a lot better place to live if others would follow these same social principles. Well, let's turn now to the religious principles which members of the John Birch Society hold in common. We believe that integrity in government, honesty in the marketplace, and social harmony, all of these must be based on morality. They can't be legislated into existence. No matter how many laws you write down on the books, if these conditions don't exist in the hearts of our citizens, then they'll never exist in our public life. Furthermore, we believe that true morality is impossible without a firm religious base. And when I say true morality, I mean doing what is right just because it's right and for no other reason. Doing what is right, even though it may be to our disadvantage, even though it may cost us our very lives to do so. But unless our concept of what is right stems from religious convictions, unless it comes from a divine source outside of and bigger than ourselves, who would be willing to make such a sacrifice? We hear a lot of talk today about the new morality, sometimes called humanism or situation ethics. The concept is that there's no such thing as right or wrong outside of the individual himself. What's right for one may be wrong for another. What's right today may be wrong for the same person tomorrow. It all depends on his attitude at the time. What makes us happy or gives us pleasure supposedly is right. If it gives us pain, it's wrong. And we must decide on that basis only. In other words, do whatever we want to do and call it morality. Of course, that's nonsense. The so-called new morality is merely the old hedonism with a respectable name. And while we certainly grant that anyone has a right to be a hedonist if he chooses, still, we strongly reject hedonism as the controlling philosophy of public life. Now, George Washington summarized this concept rather well, I think, when he said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles." This, of course, is the reason why our nation was founded on the religious principle of deism, a firm belief in God as a creator. The very first sentence in the Declaration of Independence refers to God as the authority for that action. But the key to why this is important is found further along in the words, "All men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." You see, if our rights are not endowed by our Creator, what then is their origin? There's only one other source, the government. Now, if we deny the existence of God in our political institutions, then we must accept the premise that government is the source of our rights. But if we accept that premise, then we must accept the corollary, that if government can grant rights, it also has the power to take them away. And I don't think many Americans would want to accept that if they thought it through. And so, the John Birch Society does not sidestep the issue of religion. We're not founding a new religion. We're not competing with any particular denomination. All we're doing is proclaiming the importance of religion as the indispensable foundation not only for national morality, but also for liberty. And then for ourselves, we have drawn a circle of faith that is broad enough for each member to step inside that circle without violating his own personal religious convictions. If I were asked to summarize the principles in which the members of the John Birch Society believe, I would explain it as a dual concept of individualism and morality. Individualism and morality. But we also have a slogan, which, although slightly longer, says it all very well. Perhaps you've heard it. It is less government, more responsibility, and, with God's help, a better world. The next time you hear that slogan, I sincerely hope that my efforts here will have enabled you to hold a better appreciation of the deep meaning behind those words. In the year 500 BC, a Chinese philosopher and general by the name of Sun Tzu declared, "If a man knows himself and knows his opponent, he need not fear 100 battles. If a man knows himself and knows not his opponent, for every victory he will suffer a defeat. If a man knows neither himself nor his opponent, he is a fool and will suffer defeat in every battle." Now, knowing ourselves and the principles in which we believe, as important as that is, it is not enough. We must also know our opponent if we are not to be fools and suffer defeat in every battle. So it's time now for us to climb down from our ivory tower of nebulous theory and turn to the next part of the definition of the John Birch Society that needs to be explained. What is the opposition against us? Now you'll notice I haven't even mentioned the word communism so far, except to relate it to the political spectrum. And it comes as a great surprise to those who are learning about the John Birch Society for the first time to discover that what we're for is more important to us than what we're against, and that we're not primarily an anti-communist organization. To us, communism is merely the current manifestation of certain forces that have been around for a long time under different labels. Long after communism has been destroyed and relegated to the dusty pages of history, these same forces will continue to plague future generations as well, but under a new name. What are these forces? There are two. There are always two, and there are only two. The first we've already identified: collectivism, total government. And the second, amorality, merely a 25-cent word for the complete absence of true moral standards of any kind. These are the twin forces of despotism everywhere, past, present, or future. Peel off the label communism, or fascism, or Nazism, or any other similar ism from history, and what do you find? Although the exterior form may be different, the essence is always the same: total government over the people and the abandonment of morality in public life. Collectivism and amorality. Now, we think it's important to understand this because otherwise, in our zeal to overcome communism, the American people could be maneuvered unwittingly into replacing communism with merely another form of the same thing. In the 20s, the unsuspecting people of Germany became alarmed over the inroads being made in their country by domestic communism. And then Adolf the paper hanger came along and said, "Follow me, I'll get rid of communism for you." So they followed him, and he did get rid of communism. But he put in its place exactly the same thing, only under a different flag. The good people of Germany never stopped to ask what Hitler offered behind his anti-communist slogans and promises of welfare. Most of them had never read Mein Kampf, and of those who did, very few really knew what they were reading. They were unable to recognize those opposing jaws that always constitute tyranny: collectivism and amorality. And so, in their zeal to avoid tyranny, and through their ignorance of the nature of tyranny, they were manipulated into tyranny. And it was all done through the democratic process. Remember, Hitler was voted into power. Could this happen in America? You bet it could. The process has already begun. In the name of opposing communism, we are now plunging headlong into collectivism at a rate unparalleled in history. What meaning would a victory over communism have if, in the process, we embrace total government and abandon our morality? Yet the form of tyranny called communism is still very real. It can't be ignored. All questions of theory aside, the plain fact is that if we don't defeat communism, we just aren't going to be free, and many of us won't even be alive to continue the ideological debate. And so, even though the defeat of communism is not our primary objective, of life and death necessity, it becomes our first order of business. If we are to know our opponent, therefore, we must now answer the question, what is communism? Now, actually, that's not nearly as hard a question to answer as you might think. The communists themselves give us the definition. They call it Marxism-Leninism, which means simply that communism is a combination of the ideological teachings of Karl Marx and the organizational strategy and tactics laid down by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin. Now, all we have to do, really, is understand the ideology of Marx and the tactics of Lenin. And in spite of the thickness of their books, neither one is very hard to grasp. If you've read the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, then you know that Karl Marx taught only two things: socialism and atheism. Everything else was in support of these two concepts: socialism and atheism. By the way, notice that these are merely different words for collectivism and amorality. And we're back to that again, the essential ingredients for any tyranny. But the words he preferred to use were socialism and atheism. So let's use those. While Marx laid down the ideological base of communism, Lenin created the Communist Party and added the physical organizational form. If you agree with Karl Marx that socialism and atheism are ideologically sound, then by definition you are a Marxist. But that doesn't make you a communist by a long shot. If, in addition to being a Marxist, you also are willing to join the Communist Party founded by Lenin,